Have you ever really thought about that line between what you personally believe and, well, what society expects or even demands? It's a constant push and pull, isn't it?
It really is a fundamental tension, you could say.
Well, today on the deep dive, we're jumping into a really fascinating area of law where exactly those things collide personal convictions and societal rules.
And we'll be exploring how the Supreme Court tries to navigate this tricky landscape. We're using one key case as our sort of anchor point and then seeing how its ideas ripple outwards.
Exactly. So, our main focus for this deep dive is getting a solid handle on Wisconsin v. Yoder. But, we want to go deeper than just that one case. We want to see how the thinking behind Yoder connects to outcomes in other cases that might seem, well, pretty different on the surface.
Like Locke v. Davy, Trinity Lutheran, even Masterpiece Cake Shop.
Right. We've got the summaries here. And the mission really is to track how the court weighs individual rights, especially religious freedom, against what the state says it needs to do. Understanding that balancing act.
hmm And it's interesting how, even with very different facts, you see these common threads in the court's reasoning, how they approach that balance.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning with the foundation. Wisconsin v. Yoder, 1972. Really set the stage. What were the basic facts? What kicked off this conflict?
Well, at its heart, Yoder was about Amish parents, specifically old order Amish parents who decided, based on their religion, not to send their children to public school past the 8th grade.
Okay, and this wasn't just like preferring homeschooling. It was tied directly to their faith, right?
Yeah.
Pretty central to their beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. Deeply rooted. They
Yeah.
genuinely believe that the values taught in high school, competition, materialism, secular knowledge, could seriously endanger their children's salvation and threaten the Amish way of life itself. Their community is so tightly knit, so tied to their faith.
Right. So they saw high school as a real threat, but they weren't just saying no school, were they? They had their own system.
Precisely. They weren't rejecting education, just that specific kind of formal, secular high school education. They provided their own training, very practical, focused on farming, crafts, homemaking skills needed for their self-sufficient community. It was learning integrated into their life and faith.
But Wisconsin had a law, a mandatory school attendance law.
It did. Required kids to be in school until age 16. So when the Amish parents took their kids out after 8th grade, around age 14 or 15, the state said, nope, you're breaking the law. And they were convicted.
Which brings us to the big legal question for the Supreme Court. Does the state's interest in making sure kids get educated override the parents' First Amendment right to practice their religion freely?
That was the core conflict. And the Supreme Court, in a really significant decision, actually sided with the Amish parents.
How did they justify that? What was the reasoning?
The court gave a lot of weight to the sincerity of the Amish beliefs. They looked at the evidence, heard from experts, and were convinced this wasn't just a preference, but a fundamental part of their religious identity. And they acknowledged the real danger that forcing these kids into high school could pose to that identity and their community's survival.
So the court wasn't just taking their word for it. They were looking for proof of sincerity and potential harm.
Exactly. It wasn't a casual claim. The court examined, the long history of the Amish faith and practice. They really dug into whether this was a genuinely held religious belief facing a significant threat.
And what about the state's interest? Those extra couple of years of high school?
Well, the court basically said that in this specific context, those 1 or 2 additional years of standard high school education weren't a strong enough reason, not a compelling government interest, was the legal term, to justify infringing on the Amish parents' fundamental religious freedom.
Especially since the Amish had their own form of education that seemed to work for their community.
Right. And the court also noted something else important, the history of the Amish. They pointed out that this community had existed for centuries as peaceful, law-abiding, self-sufficient citizens without formal high school education beyond the 8th grade.
That track record kind of proved their system worked for them, didn't it?
It definitely bolstered their case. It showed their alternative wasn't leading to dependency or societal problems, undermining the state's claim that those extra 2 years were absolutely essential for citizenship.
Okay, so Yoder sets this precedent.
Yeah.
You weigh the sincerity of the religious belief, the burden the law places on it, against the strength or the compellingness of the state's interest. Now, how does this idea play out in Locke v. Davy? That one's about college scholarships. This seems pretty different.
It does look different initially, yeah.
Yeah.
But you still see that core tension. An individual's religious freedom claim running up against a state rule. Here, it was Joshua Davy who got a state scholarship in Washington. a merit scholarship.
Yep.
But the state told him he couldn't use it if he majored in pastoral ministries, basically, training to be a minister. Why? Because Washington state's constitution had a provision, quite old actually, saying public money couldn't go towards religious worship, exercise, or instruction.
So Davy sued, saying that violates his free exercise rights.
He did. He argued the state was discriminating against his choice of studies simply because it was religious. But the Supreme Court actually upheld the Washington law. They didn't agree with Davy.
Why not? How did they square that with Yoder?
Well, the court focused on the state's interest again. They said Washington had a historic and substantial interest in not funding religious instruction. They drew a line saying the state wasn't being hostile to religion overall. It was just choosing not to actively pay for the training of clergy. It was about what the state was funding.
So it's still that balancing act. In Yoder, the burden on the Amish seemed huge, and the state's interest in those extra 2 years less critical. In Davy.
In Davy, the court saw the state's interest in not funding devotional instruction as pretty significant, rooted in separation of church and state ideas. And the burden on Davy, well, he could still be a minister, study religion. He just couldn't use that specific state scholarship for that specific major. The court saw it as a lesser burden than what the Amish faced.
It really is like a scale, isn't it? What's the state trying to do, and how badly does it impact the religious practice?
That's a great way to put it. The weights on each side of the scale change depending on the facts.
Okay, let's shift to Trinity Lutheran, the playground case. How does Yoder's logic apply there?
Right, Trinity Lutheran v. Comer. So you have a church daycare center in Missouri. They wanted to make their playgrounds safer using this state program that offered grants to resurface playgrounds with material made from recycled tires, a generally available public safety program.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What was the problem?
The problem was Missouri's state constitution, which had what's often called a Blaine Amendment, a provision saying no public money can go, directly or indirectly, to aid any church or religious group. So Trinity Lutheran was denied the grant solely because it was a church.
So similar setup to Yoder in a way, a religious group facing a state restriction. But the court went the other way here compared to Davy, didn't they? They sided with the church.
They did. The Supreme Court ruled for Trinity Lutheran. They said denying a generally available benefit, especially one related to health and safety, just because the applicant is religious, penalizes the free exercise of religion.
How did they distinguish that from Davy, where the state could deny funding?
The key difference, according to the court, was the nature of the benefit. In Davy, the scholarship was specifically for higher education, and the restriction was narrowly targeted at funding devotional instruction. In Trinity Lutheran, the grant was for playground resurfacing, a secular benefit focused on child safety, available to all qualifying daycares. Denying it to the church looked more like discrimination based on religious status, rather than a refusal to fund religious activity.
I see. So it wasn't funding the church's religious mission directly, just making its playground safer, like any other daycare's playground.
Exactly. The court saw denying that safety grant as a significant burden, like in Yoder, without a strong enough justification tied specifically to avoiding the establishment of religion. It wasn't seen as direct aid to religion itself, but aid to a secular purpose, child safety, undertaken by a religious entity.
Okay, one more connection. Masterpiece Cake Shop. The baker refusing the wedding cake. How does Yoder's shadow fall here? This one felt particularly contentious.
It definitely sparked a lot of debate. And yes, you can see echoes of Yoder. You have an individual, Jack Phillips, the baker, saying his sincere religious beliefs prevent him from doing something required by a general law in this case, Colorado's anti-discrimination law protecting same-sex couples.
Just like the Amish argued, their beliefs prevented them from complying with the compulsory education law.
Precisely. Phillips argued that creating a custom cake celebrating a same-sex marriage violated his religious convictions about marriage. The Colorado Civil Rights Commission ruled against him, saying he discriminated based on sexual orientation.
But the Supreme Court sided with the baker, right? Though it seems like a very specific ruling.
Very specific. That's crucial. The court didn't issue a broad ruling saying religious objections always override anti-discrimination laws. Instead, they focused narrowly on the conduct of the Colorado Commission during its proceedings.
What did the commission do wrong?
The court found evidence that some members of the commission hadn't treated Phillips's religious objections with the neutrality that the First Amendment requires. There were comments made during hearings that the court interpreted as expressing hostility or disrespect towards his religious beliefs.
Ah, so the connection to Yoder here is less about balancing the state interest versus the burden, and more about that sincerity aspect and the need for government neutrality.
Exactly that. Remember how Yoder emphasized the sincerity and long-standing nature of the Amish beliefs? In Masterpiece, the court was concerned that the state, through the commission, hadn't shown proper respect or neutrality towards Phillips's sincerely held beliefs. It felt the commission hadn't been impartial.
So the ruling was more about procedural fairness and government attitude towards religion in that specific instance.
Pretty much, it left the larger clash between religious freedom and LGBTQ plus rights unresolved for another day. But it reaffirmed the principle, echoing Yoder, that the state must treat sincere religious claims with neutrality, not animus.
Okay, so stepping back and looking at Yoder, Trinity Lutheran masterpiece, what's the big picture? What's the common thread in how the court handles these cases?
The constant theme, really, is this attempt to balance the state's legitimate goals, educating children, preventing discrimination, managing public funds, ensuring safety against the constitutional right to freely exercise one's religion.
And in doing that balancing, they look at certain things consistently.
Yes, they consider. How sincere and central is the religious belief? How much does the government action actually burden that belief? What is the state trying to achieve, and how important is that goal? And critically, is the government acting neutrally towards religion, or does its actions seem hostile or targeted?
It's fascinating how those same factors keep popping up, whether it's about school or scholarships or playgrounds or cakes.
The context changes dramatically, but that fundamental framework for analysis seems to persist. It shows the court consistently trying to navigate this inherent tension in our system between government power and individual religious liberty.
So for everyone listening, hopefully tracing Yoder's influence through these other cases helps clarify how the court approaches this. It's not always predictable, but there is a method, a way of weighing these competing values.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to chew on. Looking at these examples, where do you think the really tough spots are today? Where is that balance between religious freedom and the needs of a diverse society most difficult to strike?
That's a great question. And thinking about how the principles from Yoder and these other cases might apply to, current events or other conflicts you see, well, it's definitely food for thought. This deep dive, we hope, gives you a bit of a map for navigating those complex territories.